Hi, welcome to the Brookdale Dr. Carl Calendar Visiting Writers Series show. I'm Leah Coppola, a writing tutor in the English department and an adjunct professor of English. And I'm here today with Neil Hilborn, who is an internationally acclaimed spoken word poet, the author of 3 books, including most recently About Time, which actually just released yesterday. I'm excited to have Neil here. Welcome, Neil.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm already having a great time.
Me too. I guess I wanted to start by just asking you about your inspiration for the book.
Yeah, so the inspiration for the book was sadness and climbing out of sadness. You know, so I started writing the book in 2020 because before in 2019 I had an entire manuscript written, and then I don't know if you were around for 2020, but a bunch of stuff happened, and all that stuff made all those old poems feel really irrelevant, you know, and it just felt like something like I didn't really believe in anymore, and I didn't want to put out into the world, and so I started over. I saved 2 poems out of the old manuscript, and I just it coincided with I started a writing workshop online, and I've just been. Every week we meet Wednesday nights, and we just write a couple poems, and then we read the poems we just wrote, which is itself a terrifying thing. But and I created this whole entire manuscript just with those folks. So it's part of it was the pandemic and everything that happened in 2020. But the other part of it was just like I suddenly developed a writing community that really pushed me to get weirder and stranger and maybe a little more vulnerable with this book than the previous ones had been.
That's really interesting because, some of your earlier work is especially really vulnerable around topics like mental health. So can you tell more about that? What do you mean by more vulnerable?
Yeah, so it... with previous books and with the poems I'd done on stage, they were obviously they are vulnerable and they are intense, but I felt like I had been portraying a persona which was an aspect of me, certainly, and I was being very vulnerable about certain parts of myself. But there was a lot about me that I was keeping from the audience or from readers because I wanted to protect myself, basically, and not like there are secrets that the government didn't need to know about or whatever, but just like just
not that you'll put in the book, at least.
Not this one, but it's just terrifying to be fully vulnerable and like fully authentic in your art, even when you're being at least partially authentic. But with this book, I just threw all that out, man. I was just like, well, what if I was just completely fully sad, like as sad as loudly as I possibly could be, and being so open about, for instance, like issues with like struggles with substance issues that like I'd been having because of and before and then after the pandemic. And there's just stuff that like I'd never really talked about in previous books or poems that I put in this book that was terrifying. But suddenly putting all of that, confronting all those things that really scared me allowed me to then break through that wall and write some of my favorite poems I've ever written. Like the back half of the book is really anthemic and really joyful, and I couldn't have done that without really opening the door to the other scary stuff.
Yeah, that's super interesting, especially because you mentioned earlier that COVID was like a big part of causing you to revise this book. Can you talk a bit about that? Like, what was the role that global crisis and others played and kind of how these came together?
Yeah, I mean, part of it was that I have a bunch of mental health issues, as we've talked about. Specifically, I have OCD pretty severely, and so COVID was this weird thing where I was already pretty agoraphobic. I didn't like to go outside very much, and I was terrified of germs. Not to essentialize OCD to just germs, but that's a big part of it. And suddenly, outside was unsafe and terrifying, and there was an invisible force that was out to get me. And so I was like, oh, everything that I've been scared of has just been confirmed for me. And so it really, I felt like before 2020, I felt like I was in a really good place mentally. I was like, no, you know what? I got a handle on a lot of these obsessions, and I'm doing really good. And then that I felt like that really set me back, you know. And so I've been having to go to a bunch of therapy to unlearn, to not unlearn, but to overcome those new challenges that COVID brought up. But weirdly, having confronted those things, it allowed me to actually go way backward and deal with a lot of stuff from my childhood that I'd never dealt with before, you know. So it's the book itself. It starts off scary and depressed, and maybe because also I was in the darkest place I'd ever been in. But through that, I'm able to get to now where, well, who knows what happened yesterday, but until then, I've been doing pretty good.
Well, I have to say on that note, like reading some of these poems was very soothing. Not to say that they're like not serious, because you deal with extremely dark subject matter in here. I mean, the first poem in particular, you're talking about like what's like a suicidal break, right?
Yeah.
I want to go back to something you said earlier, which was about talking through like childhood memories.
Yes.
Because I noticed that as a theme in the book. Like you're talking about COVID, but also you have these poems that are returning to much earlier periods with these really specific titles about, you know, being on the road with this friend at this time.
Yeah.
So
Going to Chicago with my cousin.
Yeah. So what role do those play in the book, you feel?
It was something my therapist told me to do, honestly, because in therapy sessions, we'd been sort of unpacking a lot of childhood trauma, specifically through the lens of like, okay, Neil, you have these patterns right now. And it's not that you don't just have these patterns that are messing up your life. You don't just have them because you're a bad person. You know, you have them because like at one point when you were a kid, Neil, you learned like this pattern served you. It kept you safe, or it helped you get through something. And now it's not useful, but then it was. So it helped. So all of that is to say that we've been going over those horrible traumatic memories. And so my therapist at the end of every session would be like, all right, after this, I want you to go write a poem about one of your favorite memories. And so that's how a lot of those poems came out. Is I would literally just start after therapy. I'd just start a new poem with in my favorite memory, and I had about 20 poems that all started in my favorite memory, and then I picked a few of my favorites to go in the book. But it was I was trying to have contrast. If I talked about the darkness, I also needed to talk about the light.
Yeah, that contrast is a super big part of this. I also wonder how that relates to the title, because you know, about time sounds kind of like a double entendre. I'm assuming that's what you're going for. Like, it's about time, but also you're writing about how time affects people.
Yep.
So is that contrast important for that theme, or?
Absolutely. And also, to be clear, it was also a little bit of a dig at myself, because it's been 6 years since I put out a book, you know.
Yeah, that's what I was hearing. It's about damn time.
About time. and also, like, Neil, it's about time you dealt with this childhood trauma. You're 35. It's been a while, right? And also, slight little thing that is annoying, and I feel pretentious talking about it, but I realized my first two books, Our Numbered Days and The Future, also deal with the concept of time in the titles. I didn't even do that intentionally. And so when I was coming up with titles for this, I just threw that one in there mostly as a joke, honestly, and being like, Neil, it's about time you put out this book. And I sent it to Tanisha, my publisher at Button Poetry. Shout out Tanisha. And they were like, hey, Neil, you know your other two books also deal with the concept of time in the titles, right? Maybe we could just have a theme for the rest of your career. And I'm like, I've successfully been pigeonholed. Can't wait.
I mean, time is such a, like, people experience time in so many different ways.
Yeah.
And especially, like, you know, during COVID, so many people talked about how time felt both very compressed, but also like March 2020 was eternal.
Yeah, that was quite a year. March 2020 was.
Yeah. I'm also curious here about how you think this fits into kind of your broader, since you were just talking about those other books, your broader body of work. So do you see it as an evolution on The Future and Our Numbered Days? Or?
Absolutely. I think that those two, I don't know. I feel like each book feels very much like a snapshot, as any poetry collection should be, I guess. But like, at least confessional poetry collections. Anyway, they feel very much like a snapshot of the person I was when I started writing them. You know, Our Numbered Days is like poems I wrote in my 20s when I was just really figuring out how crazy I was. But also, you know, I just gotten out of college, I was reading a bunch, and I finally figured out how to write good poems, you know? And then the future I wrote entirely after OCD went viral, and I started touring for a living. So there's so many poems about being on the road and feeling lonely and sort of feeling terrified, like, oh, my dream came true, but turns out my dream is sitting in a lot of truck stop parking lots. Is that really my dream? You know? And this book, this book feels like, in the way that the future felt like, maybe I'm running away from stuff. This book feels like I am now forced to confront things because I can't go nowhere. I'm stuck in my house where all the sadness is, so I got to deal with this sadness right now. So it definitely feels like an evolution in that there's a lot of stuff that the previous books had been pointing at or questions those books had raised that I think this book answers a lot of. And then it raises some further questions that the fourth book's going to hopefully have answers for. But, you know.
Well, fortunately, we have books for years to come.
Books for years.
Hopefully. Yes.
Lord willing and the creek don't rise.
Yes. Well, we're going to go to a commercial break, and I will be back afterwards to continue talking with Neil Hilborn.
Discover limitless opportunities at Brookdale, ranked the #1 community college in New Jersey. Unlock your potential with nearly 70 associate degree programs, including cutting-edge courses in our cybersecurity center, and join our competitive esports team. Elevate your educational journey with Transfer Pathways, now connecting you to a variety of prestigious New Jersey universities and colleges. Brookdale, where access, affordability, and support open doors to your future. Visit brookdalecc.edu today.
If you loved creative writing, you were interested in creative writing, we have classes for you. We have classes in sort of an intro to creative writing, mixed genre, you do a little bit of everything. It's a fun class to take if at some point in your life you'd actually loved creative writing before kind of school beat that out of you. And here's a chance to find that love again and get credit for it. You know, it works as an elective in every single major. It transfers to all schools. We also have classes in poetry workshop, which is just what it sounds like. It focuses on poetry for the whole semester. We also have a creative nonfiction workshop, which everyone's scared of because it sounds like you're going to write more 121 essays. It is not that. It's travel writing, it's memoir, it's interviewing people and doing profiles of, you know, if you can get your hands on a celebrity, great. If not, you know, your mother or something. It's a great class. My email is on all the info. It's Suzanne Parker, so sparker@brookdalecc.edu.
Hello, I am here with the president of Creative Writing Club. How you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing so great. Can you tell me about Creative Writing Club?
It's this awesome place. We meet every Tuesdays during college hour at LAH 101. We have different topics every week, like poetry or prose, all kinds of things. If you follow our Instagram, which is Brookdale_creative, then I post when we're going to meet and what we'll be talking about every week. We also host events sometimes, like poetry readings. And we also host the Visiting Writer Series, which is once a month when an author comes to Brookdale and gives a reading. If you're part of the club, you can also go to dinner with them.
Oh my gosh, so fun. And last question, do you have to be like a creative writing major to join the club, or do you have to write to join the club?
Absolutely not. We want all kinds of people. You don't even have to stay for the full club meeting or come to every meeting. Anyone who likes words is welcome.
I love it. That's so beautiful. Anyone who likes words is welcome.
Unlock your future at Brookdale, New Jersey's #1 community college, with access to 70 programs, competitive esports, and seamless transfer pathways to top universities. Embark on a journey where affordability meets quality. Visit brookdalecc.edu today.
Hi, welcome back. I'm here with Neil Hilborn. Neil, I was wondering if for the second half of this, maybe you could read us a poem from the book.
I would love to. Can I borrow your book?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
yes.
cool. I didn't bring one up here because I'm bad at my job. I referenced a poem earlier about me and my cousin Zach in Chicago, so I'm going to read that because, ironically, I forgot to do it in Chicago last night when I was performing. This is my attempt to do penance for that. It's called Astros at Cubs, June 10th night game. In my favorite memory, it's 1998 and we're visiting family in Chicago. In everyone's favorite memory, it's always the late 90s. Cousin Zach has just handed out the baseball bats. No diamond can contain us, so we'll settle for this half acre. The crabapple tree has just shed its midsummer bounty, and Zach underhands one right to me. While the overripe fruit is suspended in the evening, let me say this. Even if I had the chance, I wouldn't be anyone else. Sure, I don't love myself yet, but I've come too far to start over now. Anyway, the crabapple is waltzing toward me, and I got so much time before it gets here. I could do my homework and clean up after dinner. I'm gonna grow up before I get a chance to hit this thing. But when it does arrive too soon, like summer, I demolish it. Absolute ripper, totally cranked. The too ripe fruit just explodes. I swear it's like a movie. We stare at each other for a moment and then start cheering. Zach is wiping pulp from his glasses. It's 1998 and I'm from Houston, so I holler, Jeff Bagwell! We're two boys unaware of the precipice before us. We're just running the bases. Lawn chair, tomato cage, shed corner, stomp home. I need you to believe me when I say this. The second the last crabapple has cleared the fence, the fireflies begin their dance to call in the night. I've never seen a firefly before. I call it a lightning bug, and Zach asks what that is. Nowhere to go but Chicago. No time like 7 minutes after sunset. Who could be me better? Why be anything at all?
Thank you. Aw,
Thank you.
I love that poem.
Me too.
I was rereading that one this morning. So is that one of the really favorite memories that you were describing in the first half?
Yeah, it really is. When I wrote all those poems that all started in my favorite memory. That was, I sent a ton of them to my editor, Michael Malekaday. Shout out Michael Malekaday, author of The Dead Eat Everything.
Shout outs to editors.
Shout outs to editors. Mike did an astounding job on this book. And so when I sent that whole list to Michael, and they were like, Neil, we got to pick a few. So pick your top 5, and then I'll pick my top 3 out of it. And that was number 1 on the list. I was like, the rest of them you can kind of do whatever you want, but it's the me and Zach one.
Load-bearing one.
It's load bearing. I love it.
What was that editing process like in general for the book?
It was pretty good. I'd worked with Mike before. They edited Our Numbered Days also. Okay. And then just to brag for half a second, Hanif Abdurakib, who is rather famous at this point, edited my second book. So I'd worked with some really fantastic editors before, and the process was really fun. I feel like we'd gotten it down at this point where I just, when it was finally time to send in a manuscript, I sent in too many poems, but we'd agreed beforehand. I was like, I'm going to send everything I think could work. And so the first thing we did is just pare down the poems that this doesn't need to be here, this doesn't need to be here, blah 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 blah. And then once I cut those poems, arranged everything that was left into what felt like a cohesive into the sort of structure that I wanted the book to have, which is pretty much the emotional arc that this book has. Then I could sort of see okay, there's a gap here. I'm missing a funny poem or two here. And so then I knew what new stuff I needed to write to fit into the structure I had. And so while I was writing those new poems, that's when we started doing just the line by line edits of the poems that we kept. And so that was pretty simple. I think we went back and forth probably 4 times with Michael just giving me just full notes on the whole manuscript, which some of it was this, I like the concept, but this poem isn't working for me. Could you try rewriting it this way? And some of the other poems were just, these 2 lines maybe should be at the end, and what if this comma was a period? And other than that, poem's done, So it kind of ran the gamut. And so, yeah, and so Mike would send me that, and I'd get another draft back in about 2 or 3 weeks, and we just went back and forth till we were I think we're good.
Cool. I wanted to ask, partially related to the editing, about your work as like performance,
Yeah.
especially performing this book. So when you're writing, are you thinking also about how you'll perform the piece, or is that something that comes in later in the editing process?
With some poems, I am certainly like I've been doing this long enough that I can kind of just get a vibe when I'm writing a poem. Like, oh, I think I could do this on stage, you know. And that's not always the case. Sometimes I'll write a poem and think I will never read this out loud to anyone, and then at a show I just get a wild hair and I'm just like, all right, time to do the weird poem about aliens, and then people seem to really respond to it, and I'm like, oh, there's stuff in here, right? So certainly, like with some poems, I am writing certain lines with performance in mind, specifically from like a metric standpoint, because like I grew up. When I was first starting to write, I only wrote form poems. I only wrote like sonnets and sestinas and villanelles and stuff. And so I still, that training has really helped me in slam specifically, because like there are some spots where iambic pentameter really outline. You pull the Shakespearean move where you're like, okay, this part is an iambic pentameter because it's important and you have to listen to it, you know? So sometimes when writing a first draft, I'll throw that stuff in there, but largely I sort of edit for performance. Like in this book, I'm opening all my sets on this tour with a poem that's in here called I Am Large, I Contain Multitudes, which is a Whitman reference because I'm a nerd. And
From Leaves of Grass.
Exactly. And that's also just like a line I quote in my everyday life.
Oh, same.
Anytime I say something contradictory, like, you know, I'm just like, I am large, I contain multitudes.
It's the perfect line.
It's the perfect line. And so when I was figuring out how to perform that poem, I significantly edited it. I cut some lines, I rearranged some stuff, because on the page I liked that it kind of went back and forth between playful and serious until the very end, but for performance that can be a little confusing for audiences. And so I streamlined the sort of emotional arc where it's like funny and playful, a little bit darker and weirder, and then anthemic, you know?
Okay.
And so that just kind of naturally happened when I was memorizing it. Just certain lines next to each other just sounded off to my ear, and then I would just rearrange them. I just had it in a Google Doc and was just rearranging it. So there's like the page version and then there's the performance version, which really just lives in my head. But you know,
that's so fascinating. Okay, because like for the fact that how you would perform the poem affected also how it appears on the page.
Yeah.
Is a really powerful example of like what performance and poetry slam offers to poetry in general.
Yep.
I wanted to ask a bit about your relationship with the slam community, because you mentioned OCD in the first half, and that was performed at the Rust Belt, right?
Yep, at the Rust Belt
one of
Regional
the
Tournament.
regional poetry slam competitions.
Mm-hmm.
And for people who don't know a lot about slam, they might not know that there was that whole kind of regional, national competitive scene until just before COVID, like the National Poetry Slam disbanded. Mm-hmm. Has that affected, a couple of questions here.
Yes.
So has that affected kind of your career or relationship with the community, and how do you see yourself fitting into the slam scene in general?
Yeah, it's funny. Before COVID, I felt really disconnected from the slam scene because largely me doing poetry was me on tour. And those shows, sometimes I'd have poets opening for me, like whoever was just happened to be local where I was at. But normally if I was on tour, I had bands with me, or I was at colleges and it's just me, right? And so I felt pretty disconnected and sometimes alienated from the scene. Not to be all woe is me, but like sometimes it felt very intentional from other poets within the scene. But I think that with that sort of collapse of that national scene, it feels like it's reemerging now, and people are excited. Like certain regional tournaments are popping up again. You know,
wow.
Like in Minnesota, my good friend Ollie Schminke has been running for the past 2 years a they're calling it the Midwest Mashup, and it's just a classic, just regional poetry tournament, you know. And this past year we had teams from, you know, largely the Twin Cities and Chicago, and then one team from Madison, but then like a team from my writing workshop just got together and went to it, and it was what like members were from. There were 2 Canadians, 1 Oregonian, 1 Minnesotan, and one Brit. You know, and they just all liked each other, and they were
That's
like, "Hey,
awesome.
do we just want to show up and do some poems together, guys?" So I think, and so like that's happening, and like the Northeast Regional is occurring. I just got a venue in North Carolina to start doing poetry tournaments. So I think it's coming back, and I think people are excited about it again. So, yeah, did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay,
absolutely.
cool.
Everything and more. Everything and
Okay,
more.
great.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad to hear that as someone who also I felt like I was raised by Poetry Slam.
Yeah, you're talking about going to Loser Slam all the time.
Yeah, which for those at home was a regional Monmouth County specific Poetry Slam. And we were talking about it earlier. So, you know, how do you see this book fitting into that scene?
I'm really hoping that it gets people. I'm hoping that it gets people into poetry. It gets them watching me, and then it gets them asking like, "Oh, what's going on with performance poetry? You mean you can shout and have feelings at the same time?" And I'm really hoping that it inspires folks to go to slams if there are some in their area, and if not, to start one, because it's so easy to start a poetry slam. It's genuinely so easy.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on.
Excellent.
So, viewer at home, if you want to start a local poetry slam,
Just ask me. DM
Just
me
ask
on
me.
Instagram.
Yeah,
I'll
just
give you the
contact Neil
rundown.
Hilborn.
Contact Neil Hilborn
Yes.
at Neil Hilborn on Instagram.
Yes.
Shoot me a DM. I got a whole list of how to start one. So,
well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a lovely conversation. For those watching at home, the Visiting Writer Series is part of Brookdale's creative writing program, which is open to members of the community. You can reach out to us and experience the joys of creative writing and maybe even starting your own poetry slam. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.